Story 1. One thing that can abruptly pull you out of your daily routine and compel you to travel to another city is the notification that your recently deceased uncle has left you a house in his will. Naturally, you must urgently appear at a specified address to claim your inheritance. Standing on the porch, my father and I read the letter, and the next day, we set off in my father's old pickup truck, heading to an unknown town in the Midwest. It was the height of summer, with the relentless sun causing the asphalt to melt from the heat. Along the road were green fields, periodically interspersed with small woods and farmlands. My father, behind the wheel, seemed lost in thought, occasionally asking me if we were on the right track. Tired of repeating that the navigator would tell us where to turn, I reassured him. He was an old-school man, 60 years old, but still fit, with short hair partially covered in gray and a small beard. My father resembled the image of a typical forester, as if he had stepped right out of an old book or classic movie. Picture a man in suspenders, a cozy hat on his head, firmly holding a huge axe. His figure radiated strength and confidence, characteristic of those accustomed to living and working among endless forests. There was always a spark of joy in his eyes, and his laughter was loud and infectious, filling the air with liveliness and warmth. When he laughed, he sometimes jokingly pounded his chest, as if to emphasize his vigor and spirited nature. My father had owned a butcher shop for about 25 years. Since we had to leave suddenly, he left it in the care of his assistant, Daryl, whom he seemed to distrust, grumbling all the way that he wanted to finish this business and return as soon as possible. I sat next to him, typing an article on my laptop that I needed to submit today. I worked as a reporter, or more precisely, a budding reporter, in my town. I wasn't entrusted with anything important, just minor articles like, Mrs. Norris received the Best Gardener Award in the county, and the like. I was finishing a piece about a local dog breeder who had a record dozen puppies. Trying to concentrate, I was still pondering the words of our chief editor, Miss Campbell. You need to go to another city? Fine, but don't come back without a good story. These words slightly unsettled me. What could I possibly write about? The voice of the navigator interrupted my thoughts. Please turn left in half a mile. Ahead was a turn leading into forested mountainous terrain. After a few more miles, the road became more winding, and the scenery more picturesque. Small houses and farms appeared more frequently, and the air smelled of freshly baked bread and barbecue. Soon, we entered the town, its remarkable authenticity striking me first. It was like stepping into another era. The streets were paved with cobblestones, and the houses along them seemed old but well-maintained. Many were built in Victorian style, with elegant balconies and lacy spirals on the roofs. We passed a small town park where children played by a fountain, and elders sat on benches, exchanging news and gossip. Father nodded towards them, as if affirming his thoughts on the local community. The main street was decorated with colorful flags and garlands, as if the town was preparing for a festival or celebration. I noticed several shops that seemed unchanged since their inception. An old pharmacy, a bookstore with windows filled with antique books, and a cozy confectionery with the aroma of freshly baked pie wafting onto the street. Along with all this, I saw the local church, perched on a high hill, with stained glass windows sparkling in the sun. Its ancient bell rang occasionally, adding a special charm to the atmosphere. Finally, the navigator led us to one of the most noticeable buildings in the town. It was made of terracotta-colored brick, with slender arched windows and intricate wrought iron patterns decorating the facade and balconies. The entrance to the building was through old double wooden doors with carved patterns and a large brass knocker. Above the door was an elegant sign with the name of Mr. Williams' law firm, done in a classic style. We parked at the entrance, admiring the beauty, and entered the building. The interior of the building was no less impressive. The lobby welcomed us with dark wooden panels and polished parquet flooring. The walls were adorned with portraits of past owners and notable city figures, as well as antique paintings and engravings. The high ceilings and wide staircases with carved banisters added a sense of grandeur to the interior. Mr. Williams's office comprised several private offices and meeting rooms, each retaining a historical style and elegance. Soft lighting, heavy curtains on the windows, and solid furniture created an atmosphere of the past century, both comfortable and commanding respect. Each room housed large leather chairs and oak tables, and shelves filled with antique books and artifacts. We approached the reception where a secretary sat. After introducing ourselves, she nodded, made a call, and then led us to the office. We were greeted by an elderly man with graying temples and a penetrating gaze behind thick-framed glasses. He was dressed sharply and elegantly in a classic suit and tie. Neat stacks of documents lay on his desk, along with a nameplate reading, Attorney Williams. He waved us to sit down. "Mr. Morgan, I hope you had a safe journey. Our town is a bit out of the way, and we rarely have visitors," he said, adjusting his glasses. "No, sir. Everything was fine. The town is actually great," my father replied. "I'm glad you like it. And this is your son, Alex?" "Yes," I answered. "Well then, let's get straight to the matter. Your uncle, Robert Harding, who recently left this mortal world, left behind a house and a plot of farmland, about 5 acres in total. As he had no other relatives besides you, he bequeathed everything to you. You can take possession of this inheritance, but there is one condition." "A condition? What kind of condition?" "There was nothing about that in the letter," my father asked loudly. "Yes, sir. I didn't write about it, but it's quite simple. You just need to live in the house for a week." "Is that all?" my father asked. Then, after some thought, looked at me and continued, "I guess we'll have to take a short mini-vacation. Well, that's settled then. Here are the documents you need to sign. Later, I will take you to the house. It's also my duty to check on you every day. I'll come by in the mornings." After that, he handed the documents to my father, who, after carefully reading them, signed. We then left the building and headed to the farm. It was located south of the town, about a half-hour drive away, and we arrived at the destination. It was a cornfield with a 2-story house in the center. A gravel driveway led to it from the north. The building itself was done in a traditional rural style. Outside, it was covered with wooden panels, painted in a warm, muted color. The roof had either tiles or metal sheets, adding durability and practicality to the building. Around the house was a cozy porch, where you could spend warm summer evenings enjoying the views of the fields. Next to the house stood a tall beech tree, partly overhanging it. As we got out of the car and looked around, Mr. Williams handed us the keys, saying that the count would start the next morning, and he would arrive here at exactly 8, so he asked us not to leave at that time. Then he said goodbye to us and left. We then began to explore the house. The first floor included a spacious living room, kitchen, dining area, and a bathroom. The interior was done in a cozy country style, with wooden furniture and decorations emphasizing a connection with nature and the land. I liked it. Everything was clean and neat. Then I went up to the second floor. There were bedrooms with picturesque views of the surrounding lands from the windows. Looking at the surroundings from above, I immersed myself in a feeling of unity with nature and found an incredible sense of peace and tranquility. As it began to darken, my father and I had a snack with the food we had brought, and, exhausted after the move, went to sleep. Day 1. This morning, the sound of the doorbell woke me up. I got up, rubbed my eyes, and yawned as I went downstairs. It was Mr. Williams. Dad was already standing at the threshold, signing something. Then they had a brief talk, and Mr. Williams left. I washed my face, and we sat down for breakfast. Breakfast was just the leftovers from yesterday's meal. I looked for food in the fridge, but it was already spoiled. We needed to visit the local supermarket. Then Dad and I decided to explore the house. I carefully checked the bedrooms, peeked into the storage room on the second floor, but found nothing of interest. Just as I was about to go downstairs, I heard a shout. Dad was calling me, his voice joyful. He was in his bedroom. When I entered, I saw a typical bedroom with a bed, bedside tables, and a dresser on the side. Behind the dresser was another door, open. I went through it and discovered a hidden room, something like a hunting trophy hall. The room was finished in dark wood, and various hunting trophies hung on the walls: deer antlers, moose, and bear heads. The soft light from wall sconces created a cozy yet mystical atmosphere. In the center of the room stood a heavy oak table with various hunting accessories, cartridges, gun oils, and antique maps of local forests and fields. But the most notable item in the room was a hunting rifle, neatly placed on a stand. My father, standing nearby, picked it up. It was a Beretta 687 Silver Pigeon III model, known for its quality and high cost. The rifle had an exquisite appearance. The barrel was made of shiny steel, and the stock and forend were crafted from high-quality walnut wood with elegant carvings. Fine engravings on the metal parts depicted scenes of hunting life and nature, adding a special elegance and uniqueness to the rifle. My father stood admiring it. Everyone has their passions, and for my father, it was hunting. Since my childhood, he had taken me through forests and mountains, teaching me how to track, gather herbs, shoot, and hunt. He continued inspecting the rifle, and I saw a gleam in his eyes that didn't bode well. Suddenly he turned to me and said, "Since we've already checked in today and have nothing much to do, why don't we go hunting?" "Stop it. It's too hot to trudge anywhere. Let's just stay at home," I replied. "No, we're going," said my father, starting to pack cartridges and other things into a bag lying nearby. I realized there was no changing his mind. "Fine, but we need to stop by the local supermarket for food on the way." We quickly got ready and loaded everything into our pickup. Dad, always attentive to details, checked that his gun permit and hunting license were in the glove compartment. He always kept them handy. One last look at the house to make sure everything was locked, and we were on our way. The road to the forest went through the entire town, northward, at the foot of the local mountain range. Driving through the center, I noticed a supermarket. We'll have to stop there on the way back, I thought to myself. The town slowly gave way to foothills, and soon, after passing the northern outskirts, we found ourselves on a dirt road leading deep into the forest. The dusty road wound through the trees, inviting us into the mysterious and wild kingdom of nature. The forest enveloped us with its lush greenery and mysterious sounds. Sunbeams pierced through the tree canopies, creating a play of light and shadow on the ground. Dad turned off the engine, and the sudden silence of the forest surrounded us. We got out of the pickup, and Dad immediately started checking his equipment. I followed suit, realizing that from now on, every move and sound we made could determine the success of our hunt. Dad held the very rifle, eager to try it out as soon as possible, while I held a simpler carbine we found in the same room. We headed into the depths of the forest, leaving the pickup behind. We tried to step carefully, avoiding breaking twigs under our feet. Dad led the way, his movements showing confidence and knowledge of the forest. I followed behind, trying not to lag. We passed dense thickets and small clearings where sunbeams created bright oases amid the green sea of the forest. From time to time we stopped, listening to the sounds of nature, searching for signs of game. As we continued through the forest, strangely, game seemed to have vanished. There was no sound of branches cracking under someone's paws, no rustling in the bushes. Everything was unnaturally quiet, and this silence began to fill the air with something ominous. Dad cast puzzled and cautious glances at me. As we moved deeper into the woods, the dense canopy of trees and shrubs made the light dimmer and the shadows thicker. The wind grew colder, and the air was filled with a pungent smell, a mix of decay and wild animal. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a huge wolf attacked us. Its eyes burned like coals, and a deep growl echoed from its mouth. It was unusually large, more like a creature from nightmares than a regular wolf. The wolf's silvery fur shimmered in the dim light, its muscles tensed, ready to attack. Dad reacted swiftly, grabbing the rifle. My heart stopped in anticipation. The wolf lunged forward, its massive teeth gleaming, ready to tear our flesh. Dad fired. The loud sound echoed through the forest, but the wolf only sped up its charge. The situation became even more desperate when the beast reached Dad and knocked him down. Shaking with fear and adrenaline, I grabbed my carbine. The wolf turned to me, its eyes flashing with madness. I fired. The bullet hit the wolf in the side, and it howled in pain. The struggle was fierce and chaotic. Despite its wound, the wolf continued to attack ferociously. Eventually, Dad, gathering all his strength, aimed again and fired. This time, the bullet found its mark, and the monstrous wolf fell to the ground, issuing one last prolonged howl. Dad and I stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the fallen beast. The air was filled with a mix of gunpowder, blood, and fear. My heart pounded in my ears for a long time, and we were momentarily petrified, stunned by what had just happened. My heart raced wildly in my chest, and Dad's breathing became rapid and uneven. In each other's eyes, we saw reflections of shock and disbelief. The wolf's attack was so sudden and brutal that it felt as if we had faced the very embodiment of wild nature. For a moment, I thought about how close we had been to death or serious injury, but fortunately, we were both unharmed. Recovering from the initial shock, we set to work. The wolf's carcass was heavy, and it took considerable effort to load it into the pickup's bed. Dad securely tied the carcass, ensuring it wouldn't slide off during transit. We performed all necessary actions in silence, each of us lost in thoughts about what had just occurred. Leaving the forest, we headed back to town. The ride was quiet, as if we both were still unable to fully comprehend what had happened. The forest, which had previously seemed a place of mystery and excitement, now left us with a feeling of anxiety and horror. On the way back, we stopped at the supermarket I had noticed earlier. After stocking up on groceries, Dad and I came out of the store to find our acquaintance, Mr. Williams, standing next to our pickup, apparently waiting for us. "I see you're getting settled in. I was just passing by," he said with a smile. But then he saw our faces and asked with concern, "Did something happen?" We told him about our hunting trip and the attack. Mr. Williams listened silently at first, but when we described what happened with the wolf, his face changed and he rushed to the pickup, pulling back the tarp to stare at the wolf's carcass. His face transformed unrecognizably, a mix of shock, fear, and anxiety. He stood there for a long time, statue-like. Dad, with a concerned, "Sir, are you all right?" pulled him back to reality. Williams, looking around anxiously, covered the tarp again. Then, without looking us in the eye, he said goodbye, citing urgent matters, and hurried away. I had a feeling that we were somehow outcasts, as if he wanted to get rid of us as quickly as possible. Dad and I exchanged puzzled glances. Then we got into the pickup and drove home. At home, we stored the carcass in a large refrigerator, typical for serious hunters, and after dinner, went to bed. It was a tough day. Falling asleep was hard. The day's events kept replaying in my mind. The wolf attack, the lawyer's strange behavior. But gradually, I drifted off to sleep. Day 2. This morning, I woke up late. My body felt as heavy as if filled with lead. I got up, washed up, and started preparing breakfast. Dad was already busy around the yard. Then he joined me. He told me that Mr. Williams had come by in the morning and had again behaved strangely, not making eye contact, quickly getting a signature, and then driving off in his car. Dad asked him what was happening, but he didn't answer. It was very strange. We speculated that maybe the wolf we had shot was a local attraction, or some kind of deity in their beliefs. But it wasn't wise to talk to the locals, especially asking about the wolf, and the lawyer refused to explain. Sighing, we finished breakfast and started thinking about what to do. Dad suggested cleaning the house. I agreed. Manual labor is the best way to calm anxious thoughts. We looked for cleaning supplies, found an old vacuum cleaner, a couple of old rags, and almost finished powder. We needed to go to the store for cleaning supplies. Dad started up his old pickup, and 20 minutes later, we were already approaching the town. As we entered the town, I immediately felt that something was wrong. The morning was quiet, the streets seemed deserted, but there was an unpleasant tension in the air. As we slowly made our way down the main street towards the store, I began to notice that people on the street stopped and stared at us. Their gazes were fixed and intense, as if they were seeing something unknown and troubling. None of them smiled, their faces devoid of any emotion, their eyes reflecting nothing but a cold, incomprehensible interest. As we drove past a cafe, I noticed people sitting at the tables silently turn to us, their eyes following our pickup until we were out of sight. There was no usual buzz of conversations or ringing laughter, just a grim and heavy silence. Even the children on the street stopped playing and stood staring at us as we slowly passed. Their toys hung motionless in their hands, and there was no usual childlike joy or curiosity on their faces. When we parked at the store, I looked at Dad, and in his eyes, I saw a reflection of my own unease. We got out of the car, and suddenly it seemed like the sounds of the city died down, as if the whole street had frozen in anticipation of our next move. We entered the store for cleaning supplies, feeling piercing gazes on us. These stares seemed to follow us, leaving the impression that we had fallen into some strange, unreal trap, where every step we took was watched with unprecedented caution and unknown intentions. After purchasing what we needed, we paid, and the cashier didn't look us in the eyes, her behavior indicating she wanted to get rid of us as soon as possible. We got back into the pickup and headed home, Dad glancing around anxiously muttering, "What the hell is going on here?" As we drove down the street, a couple of men walked past and stared at us. Dad, impulsive as he was, couldn't take it anymore. Slammed on the brakes, jumped out of the car, ran up to them, and grabbed one by the collar, shouting, "What's your problem?" The men were scared, as if afraid of someone contagious or leprous. The man Dad was holding broke free, and they ran away as fast as they could. Dad just stood there with his mouth open. Then, getting back into the car and muttering about the strange damn town, he drove home. When we got back, Dad tried to call the lawyer, but his phone was off. The desire to clean was completely gone. We sat in silence, trying to figure out what was happening. I searched the internet but found nothing unusual. All that was known about this town were dry facts, like it was founded in 1837 and how many people lived there. So went the day, me sitting at my laptop and Dad watching TV. In the evening, after dinner, we were about to go to bed when we suddenly heard a loud noise from the barn behind the house. The sound was so unexpected and loud that we both jolted and exchanged looks of growing apprehension. Glancing out the window, we saw that the evening had shrouded the yard in darkness. Dad nodded towards the barn, and without wasting time, we got up from the table. He took a flashlight, and we headed to the barn, feeling the tension build with every step. Approaching the barn, we noticed the door was slightly ajar, though we distinctly remembered closing it. The air was permeated with a strange, barely perceptible smell, a mix of metal and something rotten. Dad cautiously pushed the door, and its hinges creak cut through the silence like a harbinger of something ominous. Inside, the barn was in chaos. Boxes were overturned, old garden tools lay scattered on the floor, and bags of fertilizer were torn open. It seemed as if someone had been searching for something amid this disorder, turning everything upside down. We slowly made our way through the chaos, Dad's flashlight illuminating new details of the mess. The darkness in the corners of the barn seemed impenetrable, and every time the light fell on something unexpected, my heart skipped a beat in fear. Suddenly, something stirred in the corner, making both of us flinch. Dad directed the flashlight there, but there was no one. Just an old rag that had apparently fallen off a shelf. We inspected every corner but found no signs of who or what might have caused this disorder. Returning to the house, we felt a deep unease and uncertainty. Something was happening here. This house and this town were very strange. Dad decided to call the police, but when they found out who was calling, they refused to come, saying it was probably just a wild raccoon that had gotten into our barn. Their response made us even more worried because if anything happened, the police wouldn't come to us. We talked a bit more with Dad and decided that in the morning we had to corner the lawyer and find out what the hell was going on. Day 3. The next day we got up at 6 a.m., as the lawyer was supposed to come by 8. We decided to investigate the barn first, following the previous day's chaos. Upon inspecting it, we discovered tracks that might have belonged to a dog or a wolf. They were too large for a raccoon. The tracks were around the barn, as if the animal was looking for a way to get inside. Studying them, we figured out they led to the field. So, these creatures came from the field. We tidied up the barn and concluded that maybe we had been worrying unnecessarily, and it was indeed wild animals that caused the commotion. Closer to 8, we sat on the porch, waiting for the lawyer, but he didn't show up. At exactly 8, Dad received a message. It was from Mr. Williams, saying he couldn't come but knew we were at the farm and would mark the 3rd day as completed. Dad was infuriated by the message, and grabbing the keys, started up the pickup. I followed him. Half an hour later, we were standing in front of the lawyer's building. To our surprise, it was closed. We tried the door handle, but it was locked. With no other option, we had to leave empty-handed. As we drove there, people stared at us again, but this time they hurriedly fled if we got close. This behavior was truly frightening. It was like those internet pranks where everyone in an elevator stares at one person, causing them to feel extreme discomfort, looking around themselves, checking if they are okay. The same thing was happening to us. Near the building, a couple of kids about 5 years old were playing. I decided to approach them and ask questions, as children are naturally more trusting. But when I approached, they screamed loudly and ran away crying. "Damn, what is happening here?" my father cursed. We got back into the pickup and returned to the farm. When we arrived, Dad went up to his bedroom and came back with a trap in his hands. He set it up near the barn in case the animal returned. As lunchtime approached, we took the table out to the porch and decided to have lunch outside. The heat was unbearable, and there was not even the slightest breeze in the air. My gaze involuntarily slid over the golden sea of the cornfield stretching out in front of us. Suddenly, I noticed strange movement at the edge of the field to our left. It seemed as if someone or something was moving among the tall corn stalks. I squinted, trying to get a better look, and then I saw a fleeting figure. It looked like a person, but at the same time, it was clearly different. The figure was too tall, with disproportionately long limbs, and it moved unnaturally, smoothly gliding through the corn. Maybe it was my imagination, but there was definitely someone on the field. I turned abruptly to my father. "There's someone in the field." Dad, catching the alarm in my voice, instantly jumped up and ran for his rifle. We quickly headed towards the field, alert and ready for any surprises. Pushing through the corn, we heard rustling and steps ahead of us. It seemed something large and fast was moving ahead, leaving a trail of bent and broken stalks. But as we got closer, the figure mysteriously disappeared, leaving only the sun-glimmering corn leaves behind. We returned to the porch where our half-eaten lunch lay. The desire to eat had completely vanished. Dad kept clutching his rifle, a sense of anxiety hanging in the air. This place was starting to have a definite negative impact on our nervous system. Even my father, who was usually so composed, was visibly tense. The day passed as we tried to distract ourselves from anxious thoughts, and fortunately, no more strange occurrences happened. Day 4. Waking up in the morning, I asked Dad if Mr. Williams had come by. He shook his head no, pointing to the mobile phone lying on the table. Again, just a message. I slumped into a chair, tiredly, and started eating my simple breakfast. Today was the 4th day. Just a little longer and we could leave this backwater. Instead of a relaxing holiday, we got nerve-wracking days. After breakfast, we decided to take a walk and stretch our legs. Stepping outside, we noticed that there were numerous paw prints all around the house, all belonging to the same species, judging by their shape, but of different sizes. Dad and I exchanged glances. "What the hell is going on here?" he repeated for what seemed like the umpteenth time. We circled the house and realized that a pack of animals, likely wolves judging by the tracks, had roamed here last night. But these tracks were not exactly like those of wolves, slightly different. Dad checked the trap. It was empty. These animals were smarter than we thought. With so many, someone should have been caught. We decided to scout the area, taking the rifle with us, but found nothing. Returning home, we decided to rest. I went to my bedroom, then sat on the bed and pulled out my laptop. It was almost out of charge. The charger was somewhere around. Looking around, I saw it on the floor near the bed. Bending down, I briefly saw a small box under the bed. I reached for it and took it. The box was made of dark wood with fine carvings on the lid, giving it an antique and mysterious appearance. Carefully, I opened the lid. The hinges creaked, almost groaning, revealing its long-hidden secret. Inside the box was an old diary. The diary's cover was worn, its pages yellowed with age, and it seemed to hold stories from the past. I gently picked up the diary. The first page was inscribed in calligraphic handwriting with a name I immediately recognized. It was the name of our uncle who left us this house. In the diary, pages were filled with chaotic, uneven lines. Ink was smeared in places, as if his hand trembled while writing. Throughout, there were insertions of incomprehensible symbols and sketches, adding more mystery to the text. I tried to recreate in my mind what my uncle must have felt reading his entries. May 28th. They are still after me. I feel their gazes when I go out into town. They are not human. Can't be. Their eyes are empty, lifeless, but they watch every step I take. June 1st. I stocked up on weapons today. I must be prepared. At night I hear whispers outside my window. They are coming for me. I'm sure of it. June 5th. The whole town is in cahoots. I can feel it. Every corner, every shadow. They are waiting for me to weaken. June 10th. Tonight I saw them. They were at the edge of my field, among the corn. Huge, ominous shadows, upright but not human. I'm not losing my mind. I know it's real. June 15th. I can't sleep anymore. They are everywhere. In the house, in the fields, in town. I must fight. I must survive. Reading these lines, I felt a chill run down my spine. The disorder of the words, the abrupt phrases, and the constant sense of being pursued in every word. It all created an oppressive atmosphere of madness and fear. It became clear that my uncle had experienced deep terror and paranoia, possibly caused by something inexplicable and mystical in this town and its surroundings. Remembering what had happened in this town, I concluded that perhaps what was written in this diary was not just my uncle's sick imagination. I went downstairs and showed the diary to Dad. He read it and was also impressed, then became thoughtful and said that we just had to wait a little longer. The house would be ours, we'd put it up for sale, and leave this place as soon as possible. I took the diary to study it more closely, and the day passed unnoticed. Sitting in my bedroom, immersing myself in my uncle's diary, a piercing howl suddenly broke the night's silence. The sound was so eerie and unreal that I instantly jumped up, my heart freezing in terror. Dropping the diary on the bed, I rushed outside to find out what was happening. My father was already there, rifle in hand. We ran to the trap we had set earlier, but it was empty. Instead, we found traces of blood and clumps of coarse, dark fur. The scene looked as though a struggle had taken place, but neither the victim nor the predator was there anymore. Suddenly, Dad froze, straining his ears. I followed his gaze and saw something dark moving on the barn roof. We raised our flashlights, and the light fell on something huge and incomprehensible. The figure seemed human, but its proportions were distorted, its contours blurred by darkness. As soon as the flashlight beam touched the creature, it leaped from the roof and disappeared into the tall cornstalks. In an instant, it was gone, only the rustling of leaves slowly fading into the night. Dad, unable to contain himself, fired in the direction where the figure had vanished. The gunshot tore through the silence, and its echo lingered in the forest for a long time. We stood, holding our breath, but no response came, only dead silence and the motionless cornstalks, as if guarding their secrets. I looked at Dad and became alarmed. I had never seen such a frightened look on his face. I pulled him by the arm, and we went back inside. I had trouble falling asleep, as tension and stress seemed to build up inside me since we arrived. Whether I could withstand a few more days here was unknown to me. Day 5. Mr. Williams didn't bother to show up, sending the same dry message again. I sat nervously chewing my toast, wondering what this day would bring. Suddenly, the phone rang. The sharp, intrusive sound pierced the silence, startling both of us. My father slowly picked up the receiver, his gaze filled with caution and distrust. The room fell into tense silence, with only a distant, barely discernible whisper coming from the phone. It was a whisper mixed with indistinct voices, creating the effect of someone else's presence in the room. I moved closer to hear better. The whisper seemed familiar, yet eerily distant. The voices intertwined, creating an unintelligible chorus of threats, groans, and pleas. It seemed as if they were trying to convey something important to us, but their words were lost in obscurity and noise. Dad felt uneasy and abruptly hung up the phone, but the sounds continued to echo in our heads as if from another world. We stood, shocked and frightened, thinking how terrifying it would be to hear such a thing at night. Dad went outside to clear his head, while I decided to check on the wolf's carcass we had shot, after which all these strange events began. My instinct told me everything was interconnected. Going down to the basement where the refrigerator was, I opened it. To my surprise, it was empty. I ran to ask Dad if he had moved the carcass, but he shook his head no. Together we returned to the basement and looked around, but found nothing. So, someone had entered the house at night and taken the wolf. Who could enter the house and carry out the heavy carcass without noise or leaving any trace? And why? Pondering what could have happened, we returned to the kitchen. Dad was visibly nervous, and I opened the fridge to quench my dry throat, noticing our food supplies were running low. I suggested we drive to town. He reluctantly agreed. As we entered the town, we were suddenly captivated by a strange and somber spectacle. A funeral procession was slowly moving down the main street. People dressed in black carried a coffin, surrounded by oppressive silence, broken only by soft whispers and sobs. We parked the pickup on the side of the road and got out to watch the procession. The townspeople, noticing us, began to shy away, exchanging frightened and unfriendly glances. There was a tension in the air, as if we had violated the invisible order of this mournful march. As the procession lined up with us, piercing sobs and cries emerged from the crowd. Suddenly, a woman in black, her face tormented and contorted with grief, ran towards us, pointing and screaming. accusing us of causing her son's death. You are to blame for this. Your actions have awakened the evil that took my child." Her voice was full of despair and rage. Dad tried to calm her down, but she was adamant, her gaze burning with madness and accusation. Other townsfolk gathered around us, their faces filled with suspicion and fear. In their eyes, we saw not just grief, but a belief that the horrors occurring in the town were somehow connected to us. We got back into the pickup, feeling the weight of their stares on us. We sat there, puzzled about what we could have done wrong. After buying groceries, we returned home, away from this mad town. Back home, Dad and I discussed whether we should just leave and return to our hometown. Dad called a realtor friend to inquire about the house's value. The realtor, after hearing the description, said it would be around $250,000. We exchanged glances, then Dad suddenly stood up, slapped me on the shoulder and said, "All right, we'll endure a couple more days in case something happens. We have weapons, and I'm not afraid to make a couple of holes in someone." Dad's confidence gave me strength, and my mood slightly improved, but unfortunately, not for long. In the evening, as darkness enveloped the farm's surroundings, I noticed something strange and terrifying in the cornfield. Among the tall stalks, dozens of glowing eyes were fixedly staring at the house. Their glowing gazes in the darkness created a threatening and at the same time hypnotic spectacle. I called Dad, and he, taking his rifle, went outside to check what was happening. I watched him from the window. As Dad approached the field, the mysterious eyes began to disappear one by one until they completely dissolved into the darkness. He stopped at the edge of the field, trying to discern something in the dark, but there was only the silent sea of corn. When he turned to return home, I suddenly saw the eyes reappear. They flickered like sinister stars, emerging again and again from the darkness, forming a whole constellation of glowing points aimed at Dad. I screamed to warn him, but my voice was lost in the evening air. Dad quickened his pace, looking around, sensing something was wrong. Returning inside, he was pale and tense. His hands trembled as he closed the door behind him. That night, neither of us could sleep. The idea that someone or something was watching us, hiding in the darkness, made our blood run cold. Day 6. This morning, I felt completely exhausted. I had hardly slept, and my head was throbbing. As we sat at the kitchen table, Dad received the now customary reminder from the lawyer on his phone. We ignored it. Then Dad took a mug, which suddenly slipped from his fingers and shattered. I jumped in surprise. My nerves were stretched to the limit. After cleaning up, I decided to rest in my bedroom and soon fell asleep again. I was awoken by some noise in the hallway. It was already dark. Had I slept through the entire day? My room was engulfed in deep, impenetrable darkness, sliced only by a narrow strip of cold light seeping from under the door. A sense of something unseen and threatening hung in the air. My heart stopped when I heard heavy, slow footsteps and deep, animalistic breathing, sounding as if the source was right behind the door. The breathing was rough and uneven, as if belonging to a creature from another world. Gathering my courage, I slowly got up from the bed, each of my steps echoing loudly in the deadly silence. Approaching the door, I hesitated, gripping the handle tightly. Finally, I opened the door. The corridor was empty, lit only by the pale moonlight, creating distorted, menacing shadows on the floor. A heavy, oppressive atmosphere hung in the air, as if the darkness itself had become thicker and denser. It seemed the electricity in the house was off. Turning on a flashlight, I cautiously stepped into the corridor. The light beam sharply cut through the darkness, revealing empty rooms shrouded in shadows. I headed to my father's bedroom, my heart pounding in unison with each step. But the bedroom was empty, the bed disheveled as if Dad had suddenly gotten up and left. With each checked room, my anxiety grew. Descending the creaky staircase, where each creak sounded like a death rattle, I entered the living room where the shadows seemed almost tangible. I felt a chill on the back of my neck, as if someone unseen was watching me from the darkness. After searching the kitchen, basement, and barn, I found no trace of my father. Returning inside, I felt fear and loneliness envelop me like cold arms. "Father!" My voice broke the silence of the house, echoing in the empty corridors. But there was no answer, only the hollow echo of my cry. Suddenly, there was a noise behind the door, Restless and anxious, I ran outside to see what was happening. The night's darkness enveloped everything. But at the edge of the cornfield, I noticed some movement. Despite my fear, I decided to go there. Approaching the field, I began to make out strange shadows that seemed both human and animalistic. They moved swiftly and silently, like ghosts floating among the cornstalks. My pulse quickened, and fear swirled in my head. Around me, the shadows began to gather closer and closer, creating the impression that I was in the center of some ominous ritual. I tried to run, but my feet got entangled in something on the ground, and I fell face down. Trying to get up, I felt a sharp blow to my head. The world around me spun, sounds faded, and I was plunged into the thick darkness of unconsciousness. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was a sense of absolute terror and hopelessness, as if I had fallen into the clutches of an unknown predator hunting in this moonless night. Day 7. Waking up from unconsciousness, I immediately felt that my hands and feet were bound, and my eyes were covered with thick fabric. Trying to free myself, I discovered that my movements were restricted, and I couldn't see what was happening around me or break free. "Is anyone here?" I exclaimed, my voice sounding muffled and desperate. In response, my father's voice could be heard. "Son, are you here?" His voice was weak and concerned. I felt relieved knowing that he was alive. "Where are we? What's happening?" I asked. My father explained that someone had knocked him out in the kitchen the previous evening, and he had woken up here, also bound. From the fresh air, I could tell that we were somewhere outside. My attempts to stand were futile, but as I felt the area behind me, I sensed grass and a tree to which we were tied. We spent hours in this state, losing track of time. Thirst and hunger were becoming unbearable, and the inability to relieve ourselves was agonizing. Finally, someone approached and untied our hands. This provided some relief, but we were soon bound again. No one gave us water or food, and we grew weaker by the moment. Suddenly, we were attacked. Invisible hands struck us, and the assailant's voice uttered some incomprehensible language filled with anger and hatred. Each blow was cruel and merciless, every word dripping with rage. After the beating, our legs were untied, and we were dragged somewhere. I felt each step as painful and heavy. Unable to see where we were going, I could only feel the cold wind on my face and the menacing silence of our captors. We were brought to a place and the blindfolds were removed. We found ourselves in a clearing surrounded by stones, in the middle of a cornfield where the stalks had been crushed into a huge circle, forming a place for some ominous ritual. We were tied to posts facing each other. Night had enveloped everything in darkness, and the approaching full moon cast its cold rays on the clearing. People we had never seen before gathered around us. They spoke in an unfamiliar language, pointing at us. Their eyes burned with a wild fire, and their movements exuded menace. Suddenly, a man who seemed to be their leader emerged from the crowd. He stood in the center of the clearing and began uttering something that evoked both sadness and joy among the onlookers. After his words, cries filled with some wild energy erupted from the crowd. Then this man approached my father, grabbed a knife, and made an incision on his arm. Blood slowly began to flow, staining the ground. I screamed as I saw my father writhing in pain. The man collected the blood in a cup, raised it above his head, and drank it before starting a strange, wild dance. Others around us joined in, creating a whirlwind of movements as if they were part of some ancient, forgotten ritual. The moon illuminated their faces, distorted by passion and madness. Suddenly, the one who had drunk the blood began to tremble and convulse. His body began to change. Bones shifted with loud cracks, flesh stretched and covered itself in thick fur. The transformation was gruesome and painful. Before us stood a monster, a werewolf, gigantic and terrifying, with eyes filled with a beastly thirst for blood. One by one, other members of the cult began to transform as well. They growled and howled, their bodies contorting into unimaginable shapes. Around us, a dance of death unfolded, filled with cries and bestial roars. We watched this horrifying spectacle, frozen in terror, waiting for these creatures to pounce on us. The air vibrated with their hungry roars, and the clearing was enveloped in an aura of primal fear and madness. In that moment, it seemed as though the whole world had shrunk to this circle of horror and cruelty, where we were nothing but helpless victims of ancient evil. When the menacing creature, filled with a thirst for blood, loomed over me, ready to strike a deadly blow, its animalistic eyes glowed with menace. I froze in shock, awaiting the inevitable end. But suddenly, the night was shattered by a loud gunshot, and the creature recoiled. We turned and saw the townsfolk, armed to the teeth, ready to confront the unholy. Mr. Williams, unexpectedly, was by our side and began to untie the ropes that had bound us. "What's happening here?" I exclaimed in shock and confusion. I convinced the locals to help. It was difficult, but they agreed. "This is not your war. It's a convergence of unfortunate circumstances," he replied, his voice strained. I asked again, unable to believe my ears, and he explained that by shooting the wolf, which turned out to be one of the werewolves, we had disrupted a fragile truce. In my mind, gears were turning. Before our arrival, there had been some kind of uneasy peace here, but a hunting accident seemed to have put an end to it, prompting the werewolves to seek revenge. I remembered the looks, the funerals, the werewolves. I would never have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. The battle raged on around us. Suddenly, I saw the cashier from the store who had always served us, fighting bare-handed, defending herself against the creatures. But then something unexpected happened. Her body began to tremble, and right in front of me she transformed into a werewolf. I was shocked. It meant that the townspeople were not ordinary humans either. After transforming, she rushed into the battle, sinking her teeth into an opponent's throat. I turned away in disgust. The villagers around us also began to change their forms, but unlike our captors, they had a different shape and color. They appeared more beautiful. We got up and ran. Mr. Williams, carrying my father on his shoulder, led us to safety. But suddenly he stopped and turned back to look at the battle. Then he made a decision. "I have to help my own kind," he said, handing my father to me. My father was quite heavy, but I carried him with all my strength. For a moment, I turned back and saw that our elegant lawyer was transforming, tearing his clothes apart as he changed into something else. I continued to run, the sounds of battle, cries, and roars growing distant. Finally, I emerged from the field and ran to the pickup truck. Fortunately, it was not locked. Loading my father onto the passenger seat, I checked the bandage that Mr. Williams had managed to apply and rushed to get the keys. Finding the keys, I jumped into the pickup and floored the gas pedal. I had to save my father, who had lost a lot of blood. Glancing in the rearview mirror, I took one last look at the house and realized that I would never return there. Story 2. I write this letter with trembling hands, my nerves frayed. The pen in my grip feels heavy, almost foreign, as if I'm not just writing, but etching my very soul onto these pages. I can't believe what I'm about to tell you is real. Maybe I'm crazy. But when they tried to diagnose me, all they did was shake their heads, advising me to stop talking nonsense and try to cope with my violent fantasy. It all started 6 months ago, a time when life seemed simple, my days filled with the mundane yet comforting routine of a high school senior. I was studying hard for the SAT. The pages of my textbooks often blurred into a dance of numbers and words as I pushed myself into the late hours of the night. The silence of my room, punctuated only by the soft ticking of the clock and the occasional turn of a page, was a sanctuary of sorts. My participation in extracurricular and social activities was not just a pursuit of interest, but a meticulously planned strategy. Sports, volunteer work, school clubs, you name it. I was there. Each activity was a carefully placed piece in the puzzle of my resume, all for one single goal: to get accepted by a prestigious university. Life was good, in a predictable, comfortable way. I had a happy family. My parents, always supportive, often worried about me overworking myself, but proud nonetheless. My younger sister, with her endless chatter about school dramas, provided a much-needed distraction from my own stress. And then there was my small group of friends, a tight-knit circle who valued my opinions and showed genuine love and support. We were a band of dreamers, each chasing our own version of the future. It was a time of ambition, a time when my peers and I were desperately trying to make up for lost time in everything. Be it studies or a failed romance, there was a palpable sense of urgency in the air, a collective scramble to seize every opportunity, to right every wrong. The school year was in full swing, a routine of classes, homework, and the occasional high school drama firmly established when she arrived. Her name was Isabella, and from the moment she stepped into the school, she was unlike anyone we had ever seen. Isabella had an air about her that was at once captivating and disconcerting. She was undeniably beautiful, with long, dark brown hair that fell in light waves around her shoulders, framing her face in a way that seemed almost deliberate, as if each strand was carefully placed to enhance her mysterious allure. When she moved, her hair caught the light, shimmering with fires of hues, like sunlight dancing on a calm sea. Her eyes were large and honey-colored, framed by thick black lashes that gave her gaze a depth that was hard to decipher. It was as if her eyes held secrets, stories untold that beckoned you closer, even as they warned you to keep your distance. Her skin was olive-toned, glowing with a golden hue under the rays of the sun, and her lips were lush and red, often curved in a knowing smile that hinted at an inner amusement. Her style of dress was as distinctive as her appearance. She always dressed brightly, favoring colors that seemed to enhance her natural radiance. Wherever she went, she attracted attention, turning heads and drawing whispers. I remember the day she first walked into our classroom. The sun was streaming through the windows, casting patterns of light and shadow across the desks. The teacher introduced her as Isabella, and as she looked around the room, her gaze lingered on each of us for a moment, as if committing our faces to memory. I liked her immediately, though I couldn't have explained why. One day, I walked past her locker and saw her opening it. The way she did it was oddly fascinating, deliberate and graceful, as if even this simple act was part of a larger, unseen dance. She noticed me watching her and smiled. As the weeks passed, I couldn't help but notice that among all my friends, it was me who seemed to hold Isabella's attention the most. She often sought me out, her honey-colored eyes lingering on me during our conversations. Despite this, we never progressed beyond the bounds of friendly chats. My commitment to Nancy, my girlfriend, was a line I wasn't willing to cross. Nancy, with her easy smile and no-nonsense attitude, had been a steady presence in my life for over a year. Our relationship was comfortable, familiar. A month into Isabella's arrival, the initial buzz that surrounded her began to fade. The novelty of the new, mysterious girl wore off, and she gradually became just another student in the crowded hallways of our school. Still, her beauty and aura of mystery kept her at the center of attention, particularly among the boys. I watched as various guys tried their luck, approaching Isabella with clumsy attempts at charm. They offered her gifts, flowers, chocolates, even a few love letters that looked more like essays. But Isabella turned them all down, her rejections polite yet firm. It seemed she wasn't interested in dating, or perhaps she hadn't found anyone who caught her interest. Instead, Isabella threw herself into her studies with a fervor that was almost alarming. I would often see her in the library, her head buried in books that ranged from classic literature to advanced physics. She had a hunger for knowledge that was insatiable, devouring information with an intensity that was both impressive and slightly unnerving. As days turned into weeks, I began to notice a shift in Isabella's behavior towards me. She had a way of sitting close enough that I could catch the subtle scent of her perfume, a faint aroma that reminded me of old books and autumn leaves. In class, her presence became more pronounced, her gaze often resting on me for longer than was comfortable. I caught her several times sketching in her notebook, and one day, driven by curiosity, I managed to glance at her drawings. To my surprise, I found myself staring back from the pages. It was flattering and unsettling in equal measure. I wasn't exactly a stranger to attention. Without sounding conceited, I was well known in school. A combination of decent academic performance, a spot on the varsity football team, and a generally sociable demeanor made me fairly popular. My appearance, which I'd always taken a casual pride in, now seemed to serve as a point of fascination for Isabella. But as I sit here, scribbling down these memories, that version of me seems like a distant echo. The reflection that stares back at me now from the mirror is a shadow of that former self. Dark circles under hollow eyes, a gaunt face, and hands that tremble with an unrelenting mix of fear and malnutrition. But let's return to the story, to those days that now seem so innocuously serene in hindsight. Isabella's interest in me was a topic of mild amusement among my friends. They'd nudge me with knowing looks, teasingly suggesting there was more to her attention than mere artistic appreciation. Nancy, on the other hand, didn't find it amusing. Her smiles became less frequent, replaced by a tight-lipped concern. Our conversations often circled back to Isabella, Nancy's words tinged with an edge of jealousy and worry. The day I saw Isabella painting my face with such vigor, I felt curious. Her focus on the sketch was so fervent it seemed as if she was trying to capture something more than just my physical likeness. After class, driven by a blend of curiosity and vanity, I approached her. She looked up, her honey-colored eyes meeting mine, and with a gentle smile, she carefully tore out the sheet of paper and handed it to me. I expected her to wait, to watch my reaction, but she simply gathered her things and left the class, her steps light and graceful. Holding the drawing, I was struck by the meticulous detail. It was more than a mere sketch. It was as if a part of me had been transferred onto the paper. Every line, every contour of my face was captured with an almost eerie precision. It was beautiful and unsettling in equal measure. Later that day, I saw her again, standing by the school gates. She appeared to be waiting for something, or someone. As our eyes met, there was an unspoken acknowledgement, a connection that went beyond words. I walked over, the drawing still in my hand. "Thank you, Isabella. I really enjoyed it," I said, trying to convey my appreciation. Her smile widened, a glint of something unidentifiable in her eyes. "Shall we go for a walk together?" she asked, her voice tinged with hopeful anticipation. We spent the next half hour wandering the streets near the school. The conversation was surprisingly easy, Isabella speaking with a fluidity that was captivating. She told me about the places she had lived before moving here, painting vivid pictures of distant towns and cities. She spoke of her relatives in a detached manner, mentioning them more as characters in a story rather than people she was connected to. As we were about to part ways, she turned to me with a question that took me by surprise. "Can I paint you on a good canvas?" Her voice was earnest, her gaze intense. The proposal was unexpected, but I found myself agreeing without much hesitation. The idea of being immortalized in a painting by someone as talented as Isabella was flattering, and I was curious to see how she would translate my likeness into a larger, more permanent medium. The following days were marked by a sense of anticipation. I found myself distracted, my thoughts often drifting to Isabella and the upcoming portrait session. Nancy noticed the change in me, her expressions fluctuating between concern and annoyance. Our conversations grew more strained, the unspoken tension between us thickening like fog. When the day finally came for Isabella to paint my portrait, I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. She had asked me to meet her at her house, a quaint old building that stood at the edge of town. The house had an air of neglect about it, the paint peeling in places, the garden overgrown. But there was a charm to it, a sense of history that was almost palpable. Isabella greeted me at the door, her smile warm yet enigmatic. She led me to a room that she had converted into a studio. The space was filled with canvases, some blank, some adorned with hauntingly beautiful paintings. The light filtered in through the dusty windows, casting a soft glow on the array of brushes and paints that lay neatly arranged on a table. Isabella's demeanor as she painted was focused, almost trance-like. When she finally stepped back, signaling that the session was over, I felt a rush of relief. I was eager to see the painting, to see how she had captured me. But Isabella covered it with a cloth before I could get a glimpse. "It's not ready yet," she said, her voice distant. "You'll see it when it's finished." I must confess, there was an undeniable pull towards Isabella, a gravitational force that seemed to draw me into her orbit with each passing day. We continued to spend time together after school, our conversations meandering through a myriad of topics, from the mundane to the profound. There was an ease in our interactions, a comfort in the way our thoughts and words intertwined. However, there was Nancy. She had been a constant in my life, a grounding presence amidst the whirlwinds of teenage drama. But as my connection with Isabella deepened, so too did the rift between Nancy and me. The day she confronted me about my time with Isabella was inevitable. I remember it vividly. The accusation in her eyes, the quiver in her voice that spoke of hurt and betrayal. Nancy's reaction was explosive, a mixture of anger, jealousy, and tears. Despite my assurances that Isabella and I were just friends, she saw through the thin veil of my half-truths. Deep down, I knew Nancy was right. My feelings for Isabella had transcended the bounds of mere friendship. It was my fault that things had come to this point. I could have set clear boundaries with Isabella from the start, could have maintained a respectful distance, but the truth was, I didn't want to. Confronted with Nancy's ultimatum, I was torn. Part of me rebelled at the idea of cutting Isabella out of my life, yet I couldn't bear the thought of losing Nancy. After a long, sleepless night wrestling with my conscience, I made a decision. I would do as Nancy asked, as I had promised. I would stop all communication with Isabella. The following day was heavy with unspoken words and lingering glances. When I saw Isabella, her eyes searched mine, a question unasked yet clearly understood. I avoided her, each step away from her feeling like a betrayal of what I truly wanted. But I had made a promise to Nancy, and I intended to keep it. The day I noticed Isabella's gaze had changed, transformed from curiosity and affection into something colder, more resentful. It unsettled me. Her eyes, once warm and inviting, now seemed to bore into me with a sharpness that felt almost tangible. I hadn't expected to confront her after school, but as fate would have it, our paths crossed. The schoolyard was nearly empty, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the concrete. As I approached her, I could feel the weight of the moment, the inevitable confrontation that loomed between us. "I thought you liked me," Isabella said, her voice tinged with a hurt that seemed to go deeper than mere disappointment. "That something was possible between us. Why did you give me hope?" Her words struck a chord in me, guilt and confusion intertwining in a tight knot. Before I could respond, she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried an intensity I had never heard from her before. "I want to say something. I love you. Be with me. Or else, I will make it so." She trailed off, but the implication was clear. It sounded like a threat, veiled but unmistakable. At the time, I didn't take it seriously, but a part of me was unnerved by the intensity in her eyes. In a mix of annoyance and bewilderment, I replied, "I didn't mean to give you any reason. I was just talking to you as a friend. You knew I had a sweetheart, my Nancy. If you thought I gave you an excuse, I'm sorry. It wasn't like that." Confusion reigned in my mind. I had never been in such a contradictory situation before. My words, meant to be conciliatory, seemed to have the opposite effect. I watched as Isabella's face contorted with anger and hatred, her features momentarily twisting into something vile and repulsive. A shiver of horror ran down my spine at the sight. With a soft, almost sinister smirk, she said, "You'll be sorry," and then turned, walking away with a grace that belied the malice in her words. I stood there, frozen, as the chill of the evening air began to seep into my bones. Walking home, I replayed the conversation in my head, each word echoing with a foreboding I couldn't shake. The image of Isabella's distorted face haunted me, a glimpse into a side of her I hadn't known existed. The streets were quiet, the rhythmic sound of my footsteps a lonely accompaniment to my troubled thoughts. Arriving home, I found no relief. The house was empty, my parents still at work, and the silence felt oppressive. I went to the kitchen, mechanically preparing a sandwich, but my appetite was gone. The food tasted like ash in my mouth. By the time evening rolled around, the events of the day with Isabella had receded to the back of my mind, leaving only a lingering bitterness. Wrapped comfortably in my blanket, I was on the cusp of sleep when a peculiar sound shattered the silence. A scratching, a persistent clawing, was coming from the wall outside my bedroom window. The sound grew in intensity, morphing into a desperate scrabbling that sent shivers down my spine. In a sudden rush of fear, I bolted from my bed, my heart pounding in my ears. The hallway seemed longer than usual as I sprinted towards the safety of my parents' room. I burst in, panting, to find my mom reading at the table while my dad was just dozing off. Their surprised faces turned to amusement as I blurted out my story. They laughed, a light-hearted chuckle that stung me more than I cared to admit. "You're such an adult, yet scared like a little kid," my mom teased. I could see they didn't believe me, brushing it off as an overactive imagination. Offended and frustrated, I left their room, my mind racing with unanswered questions and rising panic. What was I to do? Returning to my room was out of the question. The scratching sound still echoed in my mind, too real to be dismissed as mere fancy. In a moment of desperation, I grabbed my phone and dialed Nancy's number, seeking comfort and understanding. When Nancy answered, her voice was a balm to my frazzled nerves. I recounted my experience, expecting skepticism, but hoping for support. To my surprise, she didn't laugh or dismiss my fears. Instead, there was a gravity in her tone that I had never heard before. She confessed that she had experienced something similar, a revelation that sent a fresh wave of terror through me. We agreed to meet at the vacant lot not far from my house, a neutral ground away from prying eyes and unsettling noises. Hurriedly, I dressed, my movements erratic, fueled by adrenaline and fear. I told my parents I was going for a walk with Nancy. Their response, a playful jibe about my being a little coward, did nothing to ease my apprehension. "Don't stay out too long," my dad called out as I hurried out the door, his words tinged with paternal concern beneath the teasing. The night was darker than usual, the moon obscured by thick clouds, casting the world in murky shadows. The vacant lot was a 5-minute walk from my house, but tonight it felt like an eternity. Every rustle of the wind, every creak of the branches, set my nerves on edge. The cold wind bit into my skin as I raced towards the vacant lot, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The night was oppressively dark. My heart pounded in my chest, a relentless drum echoing my fear. What I saw upon arriving at the lot froze me in my tracks, a scene straight out of a nightmare. Nancy lay on the ground, her body a broken, bleeding mess. Hovering over her was a creature, a grotesque parody of a dog. It was large, rat-like, with matted frizzy hair that seemed to drip with some unidentifiable liquid. Its sharp teeth tore mercilessly at Nancy's face, ripping off her cheek with a sickening diligence. For a few agonizing moments, I was paralyzed, horror rooting me to the spot. The scene before me was too gruesome, too surreal to process. Then, my stomach revolted, a violent surge of nausea overwhelming me. I vomited uncontrollably, my body convulsed. As I fell to my knees, weak and trembling, the creature's red eyes snapped towards me. It was a gaze filled with malice, a malevolent intelligence that sent a chill slicing through my already frigid body. In that instant, I knew I had to act, to defend myself. With a desperate scramble, I grabbed a rock from the ground, its rough surface biting into my palm. I hurled it at the beast with all the strength I could muster. The creature, with an agility that belied its grotesque form, dodged the projectile easily. It snarled, a sound that was guttural and chilling, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. Panic took over, and I turned to run, but my foot caught on something unseen in the darkness. I stumbled, falling hard onto the unforgiving ground. Pain exploded in my head as it struck the earth, stars dancing before my eyes. I tried to rise, but a searing agony in my legs stopped me. The creature was upon me, its teeth sunk deep into my flesh. The pain was blinding, a white-hot intensity that obliterated all other sensations. I could feel the warm blood gushing from the wound, the creature's breath hot and foul against my skin. My screams tore through the night, a desperate plea for help that I knew would go unanswered. The last vestiges of consciousness slipped away from me, the world fading to black as the creature's jaws tightened their grip. I awoke to a world of sterile white, the sharp antiseptic smell of the hospital stinging my nostrils. My legs were swathed in bandages, a dull, throbbing pain pulsating through them. Above me, the ceiling tiles blurred into focus, each one a stark reminder of the grim reality I now faced. My mother was there, her chair pulled close to my bed. Her hand was clasped around mine, a lifeline in this sea of uncertainty. Her eyes, red-rimmed and weary, lit up with a mixture of relief and exhaustion when she saw me stir. "Son, finally," she said, her voice a whisper of hope. "Everyone already thought it would end badly for you. Are you feeling okay?" Her words triggered a flood of memories, a torrent of horror that crashed over me with unrelenting force. The image of the creature, that monstrous parody of a dog, feasting on Nancy, flashed in my mind. I let out a strangled cry, the sound of despair incarnate. What happened? Is Nancy all right? Tell me I dreamed the whole thing? My mother's face crumpled, her eyes lowering as she delivered the words that shattered my world. "Nancy is gone," she murmured. "She was attacked by some predatory animal. That's what the police said. They found you covered in blood, with bitten feet, but most importantly alive." The room seemed to spin, a carousel of pain and disbelief. I felt a piercing headache, the pain a physical manifestation of the horror that gripped my soul. In a voice barely above a whisper, I said, "Mom, I saw everything. It was a dog, but it was unusual, like it was intelligent. You know." Her look, one of pity and disbelief, stung me. It was the gaze one gives to someone who has lost touch with reality, a look that labeled me as delusional. This infuriated me, the frustration and fear boiling over into rage. "I'm telling the truth," I yelled. "Why won't anyone believe me?" At my outburst, a nurse hurried into the room, her face a mask of professional concern. She quickly assessed the situation, her movements practiced and efficient. I barely felt the prick of the needle as she administered the sedative, my consciousness already teetering on the edge. As the drug coursed through my veins, dulling the pain and pulling me down into a murky haze, I caught snippets of the nurse's conversation with my mother. "He's delirious," she said in a soothing tone. "It will pass." Those words echoed in my mind as I drifted off, a mantra of dismissal that sought to negate the horror I had witnessed. But deep down, I knew the truth. What I had seen, what I had experienced, was no delusion. The creature, that nightmarish beast, was real. In the deep embrace of night, I awoke to a world shrouded in darkness. The hospital room, illuminated only by the faint glow of the hallway light seeping under the door, felt claustrophobic, a cage of shadows. My heart raced, adrenaline coursing through my veins as my eyes adjusted to the dim light. There, in the darkness, two red eyes glowed ominously. My breath caught in my throat, terror gripping me with icy fingers. Then, a quiet voice broke the silence, a voice that sent shivers down my spine. "It's me, Isabella." Her words were a cold whisper, a chilling wind that swept through the room. "I told you that you would regret it, but I'm going to give you another chance. Be with me, and your family will not be harmed. What's your answer to that?" I lay there, frozen in fear, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a hallucination, a side effect of the medication. But the red glow of her eyes, the palpable sense of menace that filled the room, it was all too real. "Who are you? What kind of monster are you?" I managed to stammer, my voice trembling with dread. Isabella moved closer, her hand covering my mouth with an unnerving gentleness. "We are called Nagual," she whispered. "We are a race of humans, mages, shamans, werewolves, but no one will believe you." Her words hung in the air, a declaration of a reality too bizarre, too frightening to comprehend. My mind struggled to process the information, to make sense of the impossible. "I'm going to leave now, and you think whether your family is dear to you. Think well," she said, her tone a mix of warning and enticement. As her hand stroked my face, a gesture that should have been comforting but was anything but, I felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Then, as silently as she had appeared, Isabella left the room, melting into the shadows like a ghost. I lay there, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to convince myself that it had been a dream, a figment of my imagination. But the cold touch of her hand on my face, the lingering sense of her presence, it was all too real. The room felt oppressive, the darkness a tangible presence that seemed to press down on me. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but fear held my voice captive. What could I say? Who would believe such an outlandish story? Nagual, the word echoed in my mind, a term from folklore and legend, now given terrifying substance. Mages, shamans, werewolves. The words were like pieces of a puzzle, falling into place to form a picture that was as fascinating as it was horrifying. I lay there for what felt like hours, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts and fears. The night seemed endless, a void in which time had ceased to exist. Every creak of the hospital, every rustle of the sheets sent my heart racing, a constant reminder of the nightmare that had become my reality. The night stretched on endlessly, a tapestry of shadows and fears. Each creak and murmur of the hospital seemed to whisper Isabella's name, a relentless reminder of the terror that had infiltrated my life. Sleep was an elusive dream, its absence leaving me in a state of heightened anxiety, expecting at any moment to see those red eyes emerge from the darkness. As afternoon dawned, bringing with it the mundane rhythms of hospital life, my resolve hardened. I had to tell someone, to share the unbelievable truth of what I had witnessed. The doctor, a middle-aged man with kind blue eyes and a reassuring demeanor, seemed like my best chance. But as I poured out my story, his expression shifted from concern to something akin to detached professionalism. My heart sank as he called in a psychiatrist. Their disbelief was a tangible thing, a wall of skepticism that I could not penetrate. They subjected me to a battery of tests, probing and questioning, but their conclusions were clear. I was adequate. My experiences dismissed as the desperate attempts of a traumatized mind to make sense of tragedy. The psychiatrist, with his practiced calm and analytical gaze, suggested that I was trying to rationalize the horrific events that had befallen Nancy and me. He spoke of grief, of shock, of the mind's ability to conjure fantastical explanations for the inexplicable. But his words felt like hollow echoes, meaningless in the face of the reality I had experienced. I was left alone, my story unbelieved, my fears unacknowledged. The sense of isolation was crushing, a weight that pressed down on me with every passing hour. In this sterile, indifferent environment, I felt like a ghost, unseen and unheard. As the day waned, a desperate plan began to form in my mind. I wouldn't let Isabella win to bring harm to my family. I couldn't stand by and watch as my life and the lives of those I loved were destroyed by this malevolent force. In a moment of reckless determination, I managed to steal a bottle of strong tranquilizers from the nurse's station. My hands trembled as I clutched the small vial, the pills inside a promise of escape, of an end to the nightmare. I sat there, on the edge of my hospital bed, the bottle in my hand. My thoughts were a chaotic swirl of fear, love, and resolve. Nancy's face floated in my mind, her smile a bittersweet memory that pierced my heart. I clung to the image of her, a beacon in the dark sea of my despair. With a shaky breath, I unscrewed the cap of the bottle. The pills lay there, innocuous, yet deadly. This was it, my final act, a sacrifice to protect those I cared for. My death would be a shield, a barrier against the darkness that threatened to consume us all. I penned this note, a final testament to the truth of my experiences. To whoever reads this, I implore you to believe me, to heed my warning. Be vigilant, be cautious, for the world is not as it seems. There are shadows that lurk in the corners of reality, dangers that defy explanation. To my family, I leave my love, a love that transcends the boundaries of life and death. Know that I did this to protect you, to keep you safe from the horrors that stalked my every waking moment. And to Isabella, if by some cruel twist of fate you ever read these words, know that my final thoughts were of defiance. You may have claimed my life, but you will never claim my spirit. Vern in hell.